So, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Talsky Center event. Our topic today is, does the death penalty violate international human rights law? According to Amnesty International, 142 countries have totally banned the death penalty either in law or in practice. The U.S. is not one of them, although the U.S. Supreme Court has held that the penalty cannot constitutionally be applied to certain limited cohorts of people. But that's a far cry from abolition. As a general matter, I view the death penalty as a human rights travesty, and for many reasons. Just sharing with you a few, I think that taking a human life, especially with the imprimatur of the state, only adds to the brutality and dehumanization of our society. If revenge is the goal, my question is, what does that have to do with justice? What does that have to do with anything productive? And a last major reason as to why, on moral grounds, I oppose the death penalty is that death is rather final. What if we made a mistake? But on the other hand, and I have to admit that deep down, there is another side of this for me. What about when the accused has committed war crimes, genocide, or crimes against humanity? I do confess something in me just wants to see them hung by their toes. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's true. I hope Professor Schabas, our speaker today, can quell my inner beast, as well as enlighten us as to the status of the death penalty under human rights law. Speaking of Professor Schabas, let me introduce him. He is such an eminent jurist that it was hard for me to select which high points of his bio to tell you about. His entire bio is high points. He is a professor of international law at Middlesex University in London and professor of international criminal law and human rights law at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I think he has visited every prestigious university on the face of the earth, including in Ireland, France, Canada, and China. He has published over 20 books and 350 scholarly articles in the field of international law, including, most pertinently, a book called The Abolition of the Death Penalty in International Law, published by Cambridge University Press. His writings have been cited in the judgments and opinions of the world's leading international tribunals and human rights courts. And by the way, he's not just an academic or theoretician, he has also practiced in these areas of law before these types of courts. He was also a member of the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission, president of the International Association of Genocide Studies. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and it just goes on and on. So without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Schabas.
Thank you very much. I think the microphone is on, right? So you hear me well. And I'm going to talk to you for the next, about an hour or so, and then we'll have time for questions about capital punishment, I want to divide it into three topics or three sections. The first one, I want to address the status of the death penalty, where it's at globally, what's going on with capital punishment. And then secondly, I want to talk about some of the legal issues under international law relating to the practice of the death penalty. And then conclude with a few minutes about some of the arguments that arise about pro and con, whether the death penalty can be justified, should be justified, what the arguments are. And as Susan mentioned, I've been working on this. Well, I published a book on this more than 25 years ago now. It was my PhD thesis at the University of Montreal, and it's been transformed 3 times now. There are new editions of the book, and I continue to work on it. It's not the only thing that I do. I work a lot on war crimes and genocide and other issues in human rights law, but probably every year I spend a month or more discussing this, debating it, and find myself regularly in countries that still have the death penalty. They're talking with those who are engaged in the practice about what they should be doing, how they should be addressing it, and what the international law issues are. You know, something that's always fascinated me about human rights law is being able to, trying to measure whether it actually works, whether we're making progress. Because people who work on fundamental human rights, we put a lot of energy into it and a lot of time, and we'd like to know whether, in fact, we're moving forward or not. And it's made even difficult a bit, because there's something that is almost in the nature of people who are engaged in the field of human rights. We're constantly trying to mobilize people by telling them how bad it is. And so it's hard for us to say, you know, actually, we're making progress. If you work for Amnesty International and you're trying to raise money for Amnesty International and you say, you know, actually things are getting better, people say, okay, then I'm going to give my money to someone else because you seem to be doing well. So we tend to always put a negative spin on where things are at. I don't know if any of you have read the writings of Steven Pinker. Maybe you know his name. I see a few people nodding. Steven Pinker is a professor at Harvard, a psychologist, professor of psychology. And he's written a couple of books. The more recent one is called Enlightenment Now. And he's very big on trying to measure human progress in different ways. And he's actually, he's written a little bit in one of his books about capital punishment because he wants to measure it. But if I said to you, is the prohibition on torture, which has been part of international human rights law going back to at the end of the Second World War, is there less torture in the world today than 50 years ago or 25 years ago? Can we measure whether we're making any headway in that area? You could point to laws on it. You could point to international treaties. You could point to a lot of talking that goes on. But on the ground, are people being tortured more or less than was the case 25 or 50 years ago? And that's hard to measure. You might have an intuitive feeling that maybe it's better, but how would you measure it? How would you be sure? You could do the same with equality issues. Is there more racial equality today than there was 25 years ago or 50 years ago? And if that is the case, how would you measure it? And if you're the victim of racial discrimination, from your vantage point, it sure doesn't look like there's less. There's more equality than there was. Is there more women's equality today than there was 50 years ago? Well, I mean, I'm looking out at a class which is very predominantly women, and that wouldn't have been the case lecturing at Michigan State University 50 years ago in law, I don't think. Right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So there are some areas where we have an intuitive sense, or we might even look at that and say, well, there's a measure. There's a measure, but we know that there's still a lot of gender inequality, maybe not at the schools, not at the universities, because women are in the majority and they do better. It is in the faculty. If you want to become an academic, women are still struggling to hit the top levels in academic careers on an equal basis. But when we go to the death penalty, one of the things that's so interesting about it is that it lends itself to counting, to numbers. We can count the number of executions. We have a pretty good idea how many people are executed every year. We have those numbers. There are a couple of countries that don't tell us. China, Vietnam won't say how many people they execute. North Korea won't say how many people they execute. So we're not sure. But most of the rest of the world, we know. And so we can do a year-by-year measurement. We can also, of course, one of the things that's easy to do is to count the countries that don't have the death penalty anymore, the countries that have abolished it, the countries that still have it. And so what do we see when we do that? Well, of course, one of the things we have to do is to count. So we have to figure out what we're counting. If we looked at the United States, now, you said the United States is a death penalty country. The United States has the death penalty. Yeah, parts of it do. But there are big parts of the United States that don't have the death penalty. We're living in one here. You know, there's a regional part of the death penalty, and it's very apparent in the United States, where, in fact, most of the death penalty in the United States is confined to a few states. Florida, Texas, mainly. And even in those two states, it doesn't cover the whole state. You're down to a few counties. And it seems to be largely because you have prosecutors who are insistent on seeking the death penalty in those counties. But I think in most of the counties in Florida and Texas, the death penalty is almost non-existent. We can do that in other countries too. Let's look at them on a regional basis. Do you know, historically, countries stopped using the death penalty probably in the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, 1750. There were a few countries that abolished it, and then they returned to it. So during the 18th century and the 19th century, there were a few countries that dropped capital punishment. Then they brought it back. They would tend then to abolish it later. There were some countries that had abolished it completely in the 19th century, brought it back briefly after the Second World War to deal with war criminals, collaborators, and then basically went back to what was for them the default, no more death penalty. Do you know the jurisdiction on the planet that was the first to have abolished the death penalty and never brought it back? Anyone know where that would be? You think it's in Europe? South America? It's Michigan. Michigan. Michigan abolished the death penalty in the 1840s. Michigan was then, of course, it was the end of the Underground Railway. And so it was a very liberal state. And it put an end to the death penalty in the 1840s and never brought it back. So this is actually the first jurisdiction on earth to have done that and not reverted to the death penalty. This one of the other features of it, you may think, well, that's impossible, that's crazy, you know, does Donald Trump know about that, you know, and as soon as they find out, they're going to fix that, they'll bring it back. I would say quite unlikely. I mean, I've been following this subject now for 25 years, very closely, and I've looked at the numbers prior to that, and it's a pretty consistent pattern of states stopping the use of the death penalty in practice, then abolishing it in law, and they almost never return to it. Almost never. So it would be very unlikely that Michigan would ever revert to the death penalty if it has gone now 160, 170 years without it. It would be very unlikely. Could it happen? Yes, but unlikely. I say unlikely not just because so few jurisdictions return to the death penalty once they've abolished it in modern times, but also because I know that the death penalty in the United States is on the decline. So you can look this up. There are websites where you can see the figures of the death penalty. The death penalty was at a high early in the 20th century. Then it gradually declined, particularly after the Second World War. I'm talking about the United States altogether, until it stopped pretty much altogether at the end of the 1960s. And there was a judgment of the Supreme Court that kind of confirmed or endorsed that, although it left the door open to reinstating the death penalty. And then it was reinstated in several jurisdictions, and then it increased. And the number of executions in the US increased until about 1990. It's like the bell curve that your professors mark you on, okay? So it went up to the top about 1990, and it's been going down steadily ever since. So it was over 100 executions a year here in the US in 1990, and now, last year it was 23. So far this year, 17. So it'll be about what it was last year, maybe a little under that. The other thing that we can count, it's very dramatic in the US, is not just the executions. I say the executions have been dropping constantly here. Also the number of death sentences. So last year, I think there were about 30 death sentences in the United States, from a high in 1990 when there would be 250 a year. And so that's a phenomenon, again, that we can map very accurately. And there are ways that explain it. Prosecutors ask for it less. That's a fact. Juries, to the extent that juries are involved, and this varies from state to state, juries accord it less and less in the United States. So these are, objectively measurable facts. I'm not talking about a public opinion poll. You go out on the streets of East Lansing and you ask people, what do you think about the death penalty? They might, maybe a majority will say, I think we should still keep it just in case. But if you put them on a jury with a real human being who murdered somebody, and then there are other factors that are involved, and then they have to think about it and they have to agree, they do it less and less. And you can have a prosecutor who believes in the death penalty, but when confronted with real situations rather than some abstract circumstance, less and less, will ask for it less and less. And the United States is not alone in this respect. The United States is part of a global trend, basically. It's global. So let me just tell you a little bit about how that looks once we move out of the United States. Even before I started studying this a quarter of a century ago, about 50 years ago, the United Nations started measuring how many states had the death penalty and how many had abolished it. And at the time, they weren't convinced that there was even a trend of any sort for or against capital punishment. There was a small number of states. Now, they started actually around 1970, so not quite 50 years ago. And in 1970, you had about 20 countries that had abolished the death penalty, or that had abolished it for what we call ordinary crimes. And by that, I mean they might still have had it for crimes that you almost never see prosecuted in peacetime, like treason or espionage or something like that. So for a murder, those countries, ordinary crimes, a murder, a rape, if they had it for rape, those countries had stopped. About 20, and there were about 140, I guess, at the time that still had it. Now there are more countries, okay? So there are 193 members of the United Nations, and there are a few little states that don't belong to the United Nations or that have a special status. So 195 to 200 countries we're talking about. That number of 20 states that had abolished the death penalty in 1970 has climbed year on year. Almost, it's if you do a graph, it's very simple. It's just a straight line to about 2 a year over that time. And we are now at, 2 a year over 45 years. According to the latest report of Amnesty International, they do one every year on this, 106 countries in the world have abolished the death penalty in law. So that means that they don't have any legal provision for it. It also means that they may have a constitutional prohibition on it that would result either from a constitutional amendment or a decision of a constitutional court, like the US Supreme Court, that would in effect say, We don't have it, and you can't bring it back unless you amend the Constitution. And of those 106, a large majority of them have also now ratified treaties in international law that prevent them from reinstating the death penalty. So they're bound by international law, constitutional law, and as well their national criminal law, which of course can be amended from one day to the next if you don't have a constitutional barrier to it, but in practice almost never is. So the number there is 106 that have the death penalty. The remaining countries, so there we're talking about 80 more countries, 80, 90 countries, about 90 countries, still have the death penalty in law, but the majority never use it. And that's an important feature of the global portrait of the death penalty because it recognizes a very significant phenomenon, states that have stopped using the death penalty and don't ever bring it back. In fact, they go in stages. They go for a while without using the death penalty, and then they look at it and they say, you know, we got along without it. We don't need it. So let's just confirm that. They build a little momentum for it, and they move forward and they abolish it in law. And that's a significant phenomenon because, of course, they can always go back to the death penalty, but then a state that has abolished it in law can always change its laws or its constitution as well and move back to it. So it's always possible to go backwards legally, but they don't do it. And so the United Nations, very early, when it started to count the phenomenon of abolition of the death penalty, started dividing into three categories. It had the states that had abolished it in law, it had the states that retained it in law, and the states that retained it in law but didn't use it. And we call them the de facto abolitionist states. So Amnesty International, according to its last report, said there are 143, I think, 142, something like that. So they count about 35 states that they call de facto abolitionists. The UN counts it differently. I know this because the UN does a big report every 5 years, and I've been the person who wrote it for them. I've been the consultant that they hired to write the report. And we discussed this within the United Nations about how to measure states that have stopped using the death penalty in practice. And what the UN's approach is, it does part of what Amnesty does. In other words, the rule is if you've been 10 years without an execution, then you're considered to be a de facto abolitionist state. Now, Amnesty International doesn't trust that because the number is larger. The number there, you'll get to over 50 countries that are de facto abolitionist states because they haven't executed anybody for 10 years. But Amnesty knows that maybe more than a third of those states, if you tell them that they've stopped using the death penalty, they'll say, oh no, we haven't. We haven't. We're still going to, we believe in it and we're still going to use it. Except they don't do it. And in the UN, I argued for this, and it's the position that they've adopted, is that, you know, that's too subjective to measure anything real. It does show you that there's support for the death penalty in the country, but even the countries that have abolished the death penalty in law still have politicians who call for it to be reinstated from time to time. So saying that intellectually, subjectively, a country says, well, don't think that we've completely gone away from the death penalty, it's not that helpful. What we're really all we're really doing is looking for measurements that show the trend. And so the UN's count now is about 56, I think, countries that are de facto abolitionists. And that category is kind of a halfway house because it's always gaining a few from the retention of states, but always losing a few that then go on and abolish the death penalty in law as well. So the number, as I say, of states with the death penalty, maybe 140 back in 1970, it's now down to about 32 countries that still use the death penalty. So that number continues to shrink. And, you know, when you look at a graph, I mean, we're law students, we're lawyers, we're not great at math, right? You know, they joke about there are three kinds of lawyers, those who can count and those who can't. Get it? 3 kinds of lawyers, okay? But we do know a graph that's a straight line shows a tendency, and when it's been going on for more than 40 years, this is just a straight line, and what that means is it's going to keep going. So in a little while, in a few minutes, I'll talk about some of the arguments for and against the death penalty. We can argue about it. I'm sure there are probably some people here who think you should retain it, that it's a good thing, maybe useful at some point. But face the facts, it will be abolished. It will happen. It's almost, I don't really want to, I've spent a career arguing about it, and I almost don't like arguing about it anymore. I say, it's going to happen anyway, so why bother arguing about it? It will happen, because it will happen here. We can see that graph in the US of fewer and fewer death sentences, fewer and fewer requests for the death penalty, and at a time when one would have thought in this country that there was a lot to kind of get people stirred up about. Starting with 9/11, I remember we held our breath after the World Trade Center saying, oh boy, this is going to bring back the death penalty big time. It didn't. It brought back torture. It brought Guantanamo. It brought some human rights violations, but it didn't bring back the death penalty. I can't explain it entirely except to say it's just that trend at work. There's one other thing about the trend, that the trend towards the reduction of the death penalty that is important, and I think it's unfortunate in a way, the approach of Amnesty International and of the United Nations in the counting is that it tends to draw too sharp a line between the countries. It's quite binary in that it's sort of, you're either in the camp of the good people who've abolished it, or you're in the camp of the bad people who still have it. And that doesn't tell you everything that's going on either, because all of the countries that still have the death penalty are using it less and less. So I prefer, when I talk about the United States or China, to say, actually, you're part of that trend. You just haven't reached the line where it's been abolished in every jurisdiction, but that will come at some point. It will happen. And I'm sure it will happen here. How it will happen, I don't know. I used to, some years ago, say, it will happen because the Supreme Court will do it, okay? The last few days, I'm not so confident that that's how it will happen, okay? But it will come about, as it has in so many other countries in the world. A few things about the regional dimension of it, because this is also something that I think is interesting. It's not always well understood. There are parts of the world where the death penalty has virtually disappeared. So Europe is famous. People say, oh, Europe it's kind of a European obsession with human rights. We don't have the death penalty. And so there's one country left in Europe that still does have the death penalty. It's Belarus. Belarus is sort of like an old Soviet-era 1950s theme park kind of country, okay? So they're outside of they're not members of the Council of Europe. They're far from being members of the European Union, and they're a bit of an outlier. But they're there in Europe, sort of nestled between Ukraine on the south, Russia, Poland. That's Belarus, but they don't execute very many people, 2 or 3 a year right now, and it's declined a great deal. So they don't have it. The rest of Europe, it's finished. So, and that includes Russia. Lots of people think, oh, Russia, Putin, they must still have the death penalty. They haven't executed anybody in Russia in more than 20 years. So Russia, it's disappeared 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So that's Europe. The Western Hemisphere. So, one country that still has the death penalty in the Western Hemisphere, the United States of America, okay? You know another one? There isn't another one. Okay. There's only one country in the Western Hemisphere now that still executes. If you look at Amnesty International's report, they'll say there are a number of states in the Caribbean, mainly the English-speaking Commonwealth countries, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and so on, that still have the death penalty. But none of those countries has used it for more than a decade, and some haven't used it for more than a quarter of a century. Jamaica's been 30 years without an execution. So if you use the UN's way of counting, it's finished there as well. But it's still there in law, but they're not applying it. So the death penalty has disappeared in the Western Hemisphere, except for a few counties in a few states in the United States of America. Otherwise, it's gone. Africa. This is a surprise for a lot of people. It's almost entirely disappeared in Africa. You have the death penalty now in a few states in northeast Africa, that is nestled up against the Middle East: Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Somalia. That corner of Africa, the death penalty is still being applied there, although it's in decline as well, but it still exists there. The rest of Africa, it's pretty much gone. Botswana in southern Africa, just north of South Africa, still has the occasional execution. But the rest of the continent, it's gone. And that's been a measurable phenomenon now for about a decade. And that leaves Asia, essentially. Asia's a little more complicated. We have the states, most of the death penalty now is in Asia, the executions. And there we have a very uneven pattern. So we have a number of countries that have abolished it in Asia. We have a number of countries where it's on the decline. We have several countries, big countries, Thailand is one of them, that is about to become de facto abolitionist. I was in Thailand a year ago for 2 or 3 days on behalf of it was a European Union funded project. And I had meetings over 2 days with the people in the government there, in the Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, talking about capital punishment and what was going to happen. The military were there as well. They're very important in Thailand. And they've gone now, they had gone last year 8 years without an execution. Next year they'll pass that 10-year point. They're very aware of it, by the way. So although it's a totally intellectual notion, this idea of 10 years without an execution, the people in Thailand, in the government, are aware that there's something magical about that date, as if they go another year without an execution, they can't turn back, which is, of course, legally not true. But in practice, it's taken on quite important symbolism there. But it seems likely, and quietly, they would say to me, don't worry, we're not going to do it. We're not planning to abolish that. We're not planning to bring it back. And there are other big states there that are sort of wavering, like Indonesia, which have a few. Sometimes they go years without executions, and then they bring it back. And then there are the big countries, the giants, the two of them in Africa, in Asia, China and India. And India has about 2 or 3 executions a decade, every decade. They don't even execute one person every year. And the Indian Supreme Court has had a huge influence on this, and they say they use it for the rarest of the rare. So India, it's still number 2 in population, but not for long. I think India is going to pass China and will become the most populous country in the world. And they hardly ever use the death penalty. And they have other countries that are sort of close to them in history and culture, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, that are de facto abolitionist states, don't have the death penalty and haven't used it for years and years. China, on the other hand, it's the big time executioner. We don't know what the numbers are. We just don't. And there are people in China who do. They say it's a state secret. I've been to China probably 20 times over the last 10 or 15 years for meetings with people in the government, defense lawyers, academics, talking about capital punishment. They assure me over and over again that it's on the decline, that it continues to decline, that they reduce the number of crimes for which they can have the death penalty, that they reduce the number of executions. And I say, so what is it now, approximately? They say, I can't tell you. It's a state secret. I'll be arrested if I tell you, So we don't know for sure. And I've taken a few years ago, I started saying, I think it must be about 3,000. We can't tell you, we can't. But no one's really disputed that with me. We don't really know. It's declined a lot in China. They're they're kind of locked into an embarrassing situation there, because if they tell you, they'd like to boast about how much it's declined, but to do so would be admitting how terrible it was 10 or 15 years ago, and they don't want to do that. Who knows? It's quite a centralized state, as you know, in many respects. And so at some point, they will just say, it's done, and there'll be a decree from Beijing, and it will stop. I think that's likely as a way that they will move on it. One thing that's interesting about the debate in China that I've encountered in the many meetings I've had with people who are, senior judges, as I say, prosecutors and so on, is that they all say, we will abolish it. So there the position would be different than it might be here among people who will say, look, we have it, get used to it. Get over it. You may not have it in Europe, but that's our decision, and we can have it in the United States. The Chinese see it much more as we're moving towards it, but we're not there yet. But it's an understanding that it is inevitable, and that it's an objective of theirs. And they say, it will come with economic development. I don't know, some of you have probably been to China, maybe some of you are Chinese here, and you have seen the phenomenal economic development of China. So I keep saying when I'm there, I say, so when does this end? When do you get economically developed enough that you can do without the death penalty? But as I say, there's a commitment at various levels to bring an end to it. And it's also a bit of a mystery in terms of their own discourse defending it, because the Chinese like to say, well, the people want it. The people want the death penalty, and that's why we have to have it. You say, well, you mean it's a deterrent? They say, yeah, we think it's a big deterrent. It deters violent crime. You say, so if it's a deterrent, shouldn't you be boasting about how many people you are executing? Because if you don't tell us how many, I say, maybe you're not executing anybody. Maybe it's just a myth. And then they smile, but they understand the argument, but there's no logic to it, finally, about how they're treating it. So that's a general picture globally of the death penalty in terms of the numbers and the trends. When it will end globally, it's anybody's guess. You can draw the graph. I used to say around 2030, not sure. But rest assured, in your lifetime, it will be gone. And your children will grow up in a world where likely, certainly their children will grow up in a world where there won't be a death penalty. I've lived in several countries in my career. I was actually born here in the United States, although I left as a child. I had no choice in the matter. My parents abducted me and took me to Canada. My mom's Canadian, so I grew up in Canada. And we had the death penalty. When I started practicing law in Canada, we still had the remnants of capital punishment because you had people who had been sentenced to death. It was still an issue. And I can remember as a boy in Canada, I was in my early teens, hearing it was one of the last death sentences. They were still sentencing, they sentenced a 15-year-old to death in Canada in about 1961. And I was a couple of years younger at the time, and I remember just being not quite traumatized, but the idea that someone who was in your age group could be sentenced to death. Of course, immediately they commuted it. The law said if he was treated as an adult in adult court, he could be sentenced to death. But it was clear immediately that they would commute the sentence. And it was a very controversial conviction. And eventually, he was released and paid a huge amount of compensation. They found the guy who committed the murder and the rape. It was a wrongful conviction, which happens. But I can remember that and growing up with it. But my kids, they didn't grow up with the death penalty. Then I moved to Ireland, and there, my students, nobody had grown up with the death penalty. It wasn't part of their life and their culture. And they look upon it, they look upon it as sort of one of those barbaric penalties you read about in the Middle Ages, like putting people in the stocks. Has anyone ever seen that happen? They used to do it here. But they don't do it anymore. And if someone said, if some politician said, I'm going to bring that back, we're going to bring back putting people in the stocks in the public square and let you throw things at them, you'd say, but that's from the Middle Ages. We don't do that anymore. And a lot of younger people in the world have grown up without the death penalty, and they kind of see it that way. Now, let me move from the practice to talk about the law a little bit, what's going on with international law. The starting point in international human rights law is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was adopted 69 years and 10 months ago. We're going to celebrate in almost exactly 2 months from now the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One of the very first rights in the Universal Declaration, it's Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the right to life. It doesn't provide any detail. It doesn't say that that includes the death penalty. It doesn't say that that includes the life of the unborn child. There's no detail about what it covers and what it doesn't. We know, because we can read the debates when it was being adopted, that there were sort of three different versions of how they should do it. One of them was they should put a comma after that, kind of like what you have in it's the Fifth Amendment, isn't it? That says, except in a sentence duly pronounced, I forget the words. It's the Fifth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment is cruel and unusual punishment. Yeah. And I think the Fifth Amendment has, well, it's one of those too. So there's something in the US Constitution that seems to acknowledge the death penalty. You know, was adopted in the 18th century. And so there was a suggestion that that be there. Many countries then, we're talking 1948, had constitutions with provisions like that had been inspired actually by the Bill of Rights. This was the case in Ireland, was the case in many countries. Then there were those who said, no, we want to put in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the death penalty, make it explicit that it's prohibited. And some of the Latin American countries wanted to do that. But other countries said, you can't do that because most of us still have it. And you can't make a declaration of rights that then we'd all be in violation of immediately. So we can't put that in there. And then the middle path, and this was proposed by the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights. Anyone know who that might have been? I'll give you a hint, an American. I'll give you another hint. The first woman ever to preside over an international body, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt said, no, let's not mention the death penalty because there's a trend, a global trend to abolish the death penalty, so let's not do anything that will stand in the way of that. And so we have this, you could say, ambiguous formulation that's open to interpretation. So it doesn't give us the answer, really. Although Eleanor Roosevelt could not have been more farsighted in her understanding of how that, it wasn't obvious in 1948 that that was a global trend, but she seemed to sense it at the time. A great person, great American, you know, maybe better than her husband, you know. Anyway, I'm a big fan of Eleanor Roosevelt. This was 1948. It was followed by treaties. So in different parts of the world, in the Organization of American States, in Europe, in the Council of Europe, and at the UN, international human rights treaties were then adopted over the next 25 years that took the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and often added detail to it and made them legally binding treaties. And so the first of them was the European Convention on Human Rights. It was adopted in 1950, and it just said the death penalty is an exception to the right to life, made it quite clear. And almost immediately, the European countries stopped using the death penalty. So they, on the one hand, they sheltered it. They put this provision in the convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, but in practice, it was almost over in Europe. And slowly, one by one, although it took a few more decades. You know, the last execution in Spain was in 1975. The last execution in France was in 1978, so not that long ago. But slowly, they stopped. In Britain, it was 1964. In Ireland, it was 1954. And some of the countries that had been on the other side in the Second World War, like Italy, Germany, and Austria, abolished it immediately. They stopped right after the war. So that was Europe. The big treaty at the global level is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it was adopted by the United Nations in the mid-1960s. And it provided not for the abolition of the death penalty, but for restrictions on the use of the death penalty. So it identifies some categories that can't be, people who can't be executed. Juvenile offenders, it's quite explicit, it doesn't say juvenile, it says under 18, for crimes committed under the age of 18. And this was something that, you know, one of the last countries to settle that in their own internal law was the United States, with the judgment just over a decade ago of the US Supreme Court that prohibited the death penalty for crimes committed by people under the age of 18. And it's disappeared. We just don't. The only time we find examples today of juvenile offenders being executed anywhere in the world, maybe a country like Iran, and there they'll say, oh no, the kid's 18. And we'll say, well, no, and that's not the way we counted. And they say, well, according to the lunar month under the Quran, no, he would be 18. It's a strange way of counting. But they have an argument that actually, that they're saying, we're not violating the rule. They are. They are actually violating it. But they claim they're not because of how they count. So it's bad that they're doing it, but it's good that they are not defying the rule. They're saying, as far as we're concerned, we're respecting the rule. It's a question of interpretation, how you count. But in principle, no 15-year-olds are being executed. No 16-year-olds are being executed. They're all somewhere between 17 and a half and 18, and there are only 1 or 2 cases every 3 or 4 years. So that's established. Pregnant women, there's a prohibition on the execution of pregnant women that's in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I don't know of any examples of that. Of a pregnant woman being executed in recent decades. In the inter-American system, there's also a prohibition on executing older people. So people over the age of 70 can't be executed in the inter-American system. In practice, most people who are executed are men, first of all. About 2% of executions are women offenders. So it's men, and they're men between the ages of 20 and 35 or so, which is, for those of you who've done a little criminology, you'll know that that's pretty much the pattern for violent crime anyway. You know, once you get to my age, you're not a threat to anybody, really, you know. And so it's young men, essentially, who are doing it, with a few exceptions, okay? So the treaties, the core human rights treaties, the American Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights all acknowledge the death penalty as an exception to the right to life, but they have limitations on it that have become more and more strict and that have been interpreted more and more strictly. So the one that's the most controversial, or that leads to the most difficulty, is a rule in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that says that you can only execute people, if you retain the death penalty, you can only apply it for the most serious crimes. That's the formulation, the most serious crimes. And that's consistent, actually, with the US Supreme Court case law as well. There are judgments now 40 years old saying that you can basically only carry out executions for homicide. And even then, homicide that is a murder, that's an intentional homicide. I think that's pretty much the state of the law. There might be some drug-related offenses where a lower form of homicide could lead to the death penalty, but you've got to have someone who's killed to do it. But it's not the case in many countries, and in some countries we think that even the majority of the executions are for drug-related crimes. And that would be the situation in Iran, for example, where they have, Iran has the highest number outside of China, because in Iran we think we know the numbers. The numbers in Iran are the highest in the world. And that region, its neighbors are also big-time executioners. So not just Iran, but Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, they do a lot of executions there. And a lot of them are for drug-related crimes. China executes a lot of people for drug-related crimes. And the argument that is underway at the international law level is you shouldn't be doing this because those are not the most serious crimes. And when I went to Indonesia a few years ago, this was what we debated with the Indonesians, because their executions are almost all for drug-related crimes. And we have these interesting discussions about it, where they say, yeah, but the crimes are so serious, look at the consequences that they have on society. And we say, well, you know, you're executing a drug trafficker. So first of all, actually, that's a victimless crime. You know, nobody's killed. You catch the person at the border with the drugs before they sell them. That's the whole point. So it's a victimless crime. It's not a crime that it's not like an assault or a murder where you can identify victims. But they say, yeah, but all of society is a victim. We counter and say, well, yeah, you know, all of society, I mean, Goldman Sachs was responsible for a lot of suffering in the country as well. But we're not calling for the execution of the bankers. Now, I waver on that point. You know, you waver on the war criminals and I waver on the bankers. But, you know, we all have our little, you know, weaknesses there. But ultimately, I think the argument based on establishing the gravity of the crime by the fact that as a phenomenon, it contributes to terrible consequences, really we should be executing environmental criminals, bankers, and the people who've really caused so much harm to our world and to our societies. But we don't, and we're not going to, and no one's ever really suggesting it. And so it's a very difficult thing. The UN constantly releases statements on this, but they're not that helpful, I find. I'm involved in it and I'm involved in the process, but I'm not convinced by how it's done, because basically our position is we'd like to say that every crime is not serious enough for the death penalty because we want to abolish it. So we don't really have a methodology for explaining how to determine those that are most serious and those that aren't. I have a suggestion, but I keep putting it out there, but I haven't managed maybe to convince enough people. But I don't give up. I'll try and convince you guys, okay? And that is that one of the things you have to look at is whether the crime itself is universally viewed as being a serious crime, regardless of the penalty. So you could make an argument then that rape, or certainly a rape with a violent rape in the sense that it injured the victim, would be a serious crime. Every society would recognize that as a serious crime. They might not all punish it effectively, but it would pass that threshold of being in the very serious category. The problem with the drug crimes is that they're not crimes in a lot of places. There are more and more countries that are experimenting with different forms of decriminalization of drugs. And so, to me, if it doesn't, I mean, you can get the death penalty in China or in Thailand for bringing in a lot of marijuana. You know, I guess you could go to Colorado, stock up, fly into China, you could get the death penalty for it. So that doesn't, to me, that just shows that the whole debate, about which I'm not expressing an opinion. You know, I'm not here to argue whether cocaine should be decriminalized or not. But the whole issue, I know you have someone talking about the opiates next in the, but that whole issue is so controversial that what we can take away from it is there's not enough of a global consensus that this is a serious crime for it to be ratcheted into the category of being the most serious crimes. Part of this too, this discussion about the most serious crimes is, and this is a philosophical issue, they have to involve homicide because there's this sense that if you take a life, so, you know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that somehow the death penalty can be justified as a penalty for a homicide type crime because you've taken a life, so you pay for it. And that's a difficult notion as well in criminal justice, in criminology. We can discuss how appropriate that is. You know, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea goes back millennia, before the Bible, to Hammurabi in Iraq, in modern day Iraq. And it's a notion that actually is there to address proportionality in punishment. It wasn't originally meant as a notion of retribution for crimes, that you have to be punished severely if you do something like take an eye or a tooth. It was, you can't go beyond that. You take an eye, you can pay with your eye, but not with two eyes. It was a rule of proportionality, but it's evolved over time to mean something a little different. So the other thing that I need to say about the law on the death penalty, international law, is that after these treaties were adopted in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, there was already a strong movement in many other countries to abolish the death penalty, and so they wanted to amend the treaties. And they amended them. It's harder to amend a treaty than it is to amend a constitution because you just have too many pieces. You've got too many countries who've signed up to the treaty, And to get them to agree, all of them, you've got to get them all to agree. It's not even like amending the Constitution here in the United States. You've got to get them all to agree to it. And so what you do when you want to amend a treaty, if it's a controversial issue like this, where not everybody's on board, is you make what we call a protocol. And you allow states to sign up to the protocol that has the effect of amending the treaty for them. So that process started in the 1980s, and now we have about 90 countries in the world that have ratified those protocols. So of the 106 countries that Amnesty International has counted as being abolitionist in law, because you're not going to ratify one of those protocols if you're just de facto abolitionist. I don't think so. We try to convince those states to do it, but they said, oh no, come on, we can't. We've got to fix it in our own law first. So we're at about 90 out of 106 possible candidates. And when we look at the remaining 16 or so, they tend to be, they're small island states in the Pacific Ocean, and they say, oh, this is too, we just don't move that quickly, we can't do it all. They have sort of a good reason for not doing it. It's not that they haven't done it because they're opposed to the treaty. Most of them, the ones that remain, just haven't got around to it. And the treaties sometimes seem to be quite symbolic, but recently they have shown themselves to be extremely important obstacles when a country is thinking of reinstating the death penalty. So you may know that in some countries in the world, there's a phenomenon of sort of populist, demagogic politicians who take power, Not naming any countries. Do you know of anyone near, any country near here with that? I'm talking about the Philippines and Turkey, okay? So two people who became the heads of state in the Philippines, and Erdogan in Turkey, and Duterte in the Philippines, the leaders, have both made statements a few years ago saying, we're going to bring back the death penalty. In fact, in Turkey, after the attempted coup in July of 2016, President Erdogan said, we're going to bring it back for the people who did the coup. Now, not only is there a problem bringing it back, there's a serious problem bringing it back retroactively, okay? And I mean, even Iran, even North Korea would say, you can't do that, that's against human rights. They would say that to Turkey, okay? You can't bring it back retroactively. You could bring it back, except the problem is, both Turkey and the Philippines have ratified those treaties. And so to bring it back, they would have to denounce those treaties, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its protocol do not have a denunciation clause. The whole idea of them is, once you're in, it's like the mafia. You can't get out, you're in. You only, so it's a one-way street. And so there's a big legal impediment to them doing this. And it's not even so simple as the head of state saying, I'm going to denounce that treaty, because there's no denunciation clause. So they've been constantly reminded of it. There's no doubt that there are senior advisors in these two countries saying to the president, you can't do it, you can't do it. And sometimes the president will say, I don't care about international law. And then they say, it's not just about the death penalty. We need international law for trade. We need it for the internet. We need it for telecommunications. We need it for all kinds of, we need it for shipping. And we can't become outlaws. Because once they become outlaws and they break an agreement that they made, then no one can trust them, because they say, well, you don't care about an agreement you signed, we're not going to make any agreement with you. That's the price that they might have to pay. So these treaties that abolish the death penalty have proven to be a very, very useful and effective. And what's happened is, in both those countries, in the Philippines and in Turkey, the noise that Erdogan and Duterte were generating 2 years ago has stopped. They've just forgotten about it, it seems. So we'll see what the future holds. Nobody knows what the future holds, but it seems it was a little storm that has passed now. And the legal rules that have been developed over the decades prove to be, the international legal rules, prove to be a very effective obstacle to that happening. So I said, I'm going to go briefly now, just a couple of points about the third part. I said I'd talk about a few of the arguments that are raised about the death penalty. The first one that you often hear people say is, you hear this from abolitionist people, they say, it's not a deterrent. Studies have shown it's not a deterrent. And I just want to have a few ideas on that point. I think it's not a good formulation. To me, it's clear that the death penalty is a deterrent, just like any severe punishment is a deterrent, okay? You know about this phenomenon that, I don't know if it exists in the US, but it certainly exists at my university in the United Kingdom, of students who buy essays from a company, okay? It happens here, right? Yeah. And we have ways of checking it up to a point. Of course, everything we run through, turn it in to check if there's plagiarism. But if someone's had a bespoke essay written for them, it's kind of hard to detect using the plagiarism software. If we said, you know, it's very hard to catch someone who does that, but if we catch you, it'll be a crime with a minimum sentence of 20 years in jail, I think that might solve the problem. I really think that some of the people who will do it have calculated that the penalties, what's the worst that could happen? I'd be thrown out of university. I was going to fail anyway, so what's the difference, you know? But if you made it 20 years in jail, you wouldn't have to make it the death penalty to deter them, but a severe penalty might make a big difference. If you made it a 20-year minimum to drive a car while you were intoxicated, there'd be probably liquor sales would drop, okay? The taxi business would increase. You know, you'd be able to measure that happening. The point is that what we should say is, and what we want to know is the death penalty a superior deterrent to other severe punishments? And that's the thing that we don't know the answer to, and we never will. The people who advocate the death penalty can't prove that it is, and the people who are against the death penalty can't prove the opposite. The only way we could do it would be with a proper experiment where we had samples where we said, look, you're going to get the death penalty, mandatory death penalty, for sure, if you do this crime. And we had a jurisdiction where that happened. But of course, no country would do that. If you executed everybody in the United States who qualified for the death penalty, you'd be back to 2,000 executions a year from 20. You're not going to do that. No one's going to do that. You couldn't do an experiment like that. So how do we know? Occasionally we have little incidents that confirm that it's not, that we don't know that it's a better deterrent. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, there was a case in DC, in Washington, of what were called the Beltway snipers. That was what they were labeled. You'll remember that they were two guys. One was a man about 40-ish, named Malvo, I think, and he had a kid with him who was 17, and they would drive around in an old car, and in the trunk of the car, they had a little hole hollowed out, and they had a rifle, and they would park the car near an expressway, and they would just kill someone at random. And there were, I don't remember how many, 10, 15, 20 people killed. They were called the Beltway snipers because they did this in Washington, on the Beltway. They would drive around that area, around Washington, they'd pull off the Beltway, and they would just park the car, and they would kill somebody. So, Washington, D.C., there's no death penalty. I don't know if they ever had it in Washington, but they certainly haven't had it.
Yeah,
They did, but a long, long time ago.
it ended in the 50s.
In the 50s. Then around Washington, of course, you've got Maryland and Virginia. So at the time, you had the death penalty in both of those states, and in Virginia, you had the death penalty for juveniles, not in Maryland. Maryland's now abolished the death penalty, and of course, Virginia doesn't have it for juveniles because of the Supreme Court judgment, but not then. So you've got a juvenile and an adult driving around the Beltway. So, hey, it's pretty easy. You just have to turn right off the Beltway and stay in DC, and you can't get the death penalty, right? You turn left off the Beltway and you go into Virginia or Maryland, you're subject to the death penalty. And these guys, they turn left. They go into Virginia and into Maryland and not into DC for the executions. How do you explain that? You know, people, well, they don't know, or they don't care. And I say, I rest my case. That's the point. And I think people, generally, with those types of crimes, the criminals aren't calculating, saying, I think I'll do it in a non-death penalty jurisdiction just to be on the safe side. They think they'll get away with it. So again, this is an anecdotal example. It's not really a scientific experiment. But we can't do a scientific experiment. The real point to make is nobody knows, and there's not any evidence to suggest it, that the death penalty is a significantly superior deterrent than a protracted sentence of imprisonment. And that's what we're talking about. It's not as if we abolish the death penalty, you're not going to punish someone who commits a murder. They're going to be severely punished, but not with death. So that's just my comment on the issue of deterrence. The second one, which is an issue that arises in the political debates in many countries, including in Europe a bit, is the public wants it. And we have to be democratic, and we have to respect public opinion. I hear this when I go to China. They say, we have to respect public opinion. The public wants the death penalty. I say, well, you didn't listen to the public when you had the one-child policy in China. It wasn't as if you were concerned about that. You said, the public may not like it, but this is what's good for them. So you don't always honor public opinion in that respect. But that being said, we know more about public opinion now, and we have different ways of measuring it. One of the things I did in China several years ago was participate in a project with 2 Chinese universities where we studied in more detail public opinion, the way you would do here in the United States. So instead of just saying, are you for or against the death penalty? Yeah, you'll get a big majority saying, yeah, let's keep it. It doesn't do any harm, let's keep it just in case. But when you start, and this happens here in the US, and it happens in China too, if you say, how about if instead of, we have an alternative, which would be life imprisonment without parole. And then in China, you get lower than 50% who still want the death penalty. And if you give them cases that are real cases, of facts of real people who've been sentenced to death, and you repeat, they'll say, no, I wouldn't execute them for that. So what we find is that in many countries, that it's much more nuanced, the attitude towards the death penalty, and that just saying a majority support the death penalty, it's not a very accurate way of assessing public opinion. The second observation is, and this is harder to measure, it's maybe more intuitive, but it's not very important to people, actually. Everyone has an opinion on it. Just like if you stop someone on the street and say, so what do you think of the weather? Do you think it should be colder or warmer? You know, they'll have an opinion on it. But if you say, okay, so now we're going to I'd like you to get very involved for the next year in a campaign about changing the weather, they'll say, come on, I have more important things to do, more productive things to do. It's not something that's very important to people. And where I think you can see this is when you see, you can see this much more uncertain status of public opinion if you look at politicians in different parts of the world, what they campaign on. I mean, here in the United States, you have some politicians, including your current president, who campaign on a lot of hot issues to get people stirred up, like building the famous wall in Mexico to stop all the rapists coming across the border from South America. Did he campaign on the death penalty? If public opinion was so convinced, you'd think that would be a central point of the campaign, and it wasn't. And it isn't in Europe either. People say to me, you know, you Europeans, you abolished the death penalty, but that's the elite. The people still want the death penalty. Well, we have right-wing politicians in Europe. We have very, significant groups. They campaign against immigrants. They hate immigrants. They hate immigration. They campaign on some hot-button issues that people do get very excited about, but they don't campaign on the death penalty. In France, where I live a lot, we have a right-wing, quite a racist party. The former leader of it was a Holocaust denier. I mean, a pretty nasty bunch of people. They don't campaign on the death penalty. It's not really even in their program, bringing back the death penalty. So if public opinion was so enthusiastic about it, you'd see that being a more important part of the political campaigns, and you don't generally. Now, I know it arises here, especially, it's a sensitive thing because judges and prosecutors are elected here, and so sometimes they'll campaign saying, I'm going to keep the death penalty, but the vast majority of your prosecutors aren't asking for it anymore. And if they were so vulnerable to being defeated in an election on that, you'd expect them to behave differently, and they don't. So I think that the people in the system, the politicians, and this is global, here in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, they sense that as well. They have a good intuition often, good instincts about public opinion that isn't measured by public opinion polls, and they know what the public gets excited about, and they know what it doesn't. And they don't seem to be very keen on pushing the death penalty issue. I mentioned even in Turkey and the Philippines where they tried to push it, and they've stopped. They've gone silent on the issue. Well, I've spoken for longer than I thought I would. I could go on longer, but I know that you probably have a class at 1:30, and I'm going to stop for some questions and comments if you have them. Please.
So first, thank you so much for your presentation and your time. I was wondering if any of the international treaties discuss the means in which executions are conducted, because even just I'm not as familiar with other countries, but even just looking at the US, it's changed a few times, and before, I mean, a long time ago it used to be more public, and now it's kind of evolved, and it went from using the electric chair to using this whatever new 3-drug method, and so of course torture is prohibited internationally through treaties and things like that, but what, I guess, is there any sort of discussion on the means in which execution is used, especially?
Yeah, well there is, and there are a few cases on it. There's actually an old case decided under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights it was an extradition from Canada to the United States, someone who was going to California, I think, where they still had the gas chamber. And so an international tribunal called the Human Rights Committee ruled that the execution by the gas chamber amounted to, well, in the international law we say cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. It's the same as the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. They said that would be unacceptable. You know, you have cases at the US Supreme Court on this too, going right back to the use of the electric chair in the 1890s, and you have some gas chamber cases. You have some hanging cases too. There's a whole body. You know, the US, because of the very elaborate and sophisticated justice system, has the most elaborate case law on it as well. At the international level, though, there's nothing prescriptive, nothing in any of the treaties. Remember, you have to get everyone to agree on it. And you wouldn't get any agreement on what that could involve. And the countries that are abolitionists, who are in the vast majority, are never going to really get engaged in deciding what are the right ways to execute people as opposed to the wrong ways. They'll say every way is wrong. So it'd be very hard to move forward on that. In practice, it's not quite universal, but very widespread now, is what we call lethal injection. But I hate these terms because they're euphemisms, and we should call them what they really are. It's poisoning. You know, poisoning, suffocating, you know, electrocution. And the hanging. Hanging is still used in a few places too. And there are a few places where it's pretty ugly. So Saudi Arabia is the worst, but it's a real outlier. Saudi Arabia does it in public with a sword. And the crowd gathers and you see the guy's head getting chopped off. You'll find pictures of it on the internet if you're interested in seeing it, because someone will be there now. You know, everyone has a camera, so someone quietly gets a snap of it.
And just to follow up to your public comment, so do you feel like if we made it public again, there would be a bigger outcry against it, like there were in other places? Because now it's so hidden and you don't really see what's happening, and it's, you know, kind of behind closed doors. Like, would that change? I guess this idea of the public would care more if it's something that was in front of them and like out in an, I don't know, whatever field.
You know, I think there's pretty universal agreement now. Again, there's an exception of a few countries that are doing it publicly, but that it should not be in public. But of course, if you argue the deterrent effect, you want it to be in public, don't you? People say that, but there are debates about that too. They tell stories about how in the UK, in London, in England, 200 years ago, they had the death penalty for like trivial crimes, pickpocketing. They would hang pickpockets. And there are stories about, there's a place in London, Tyburn, it's where you have the Marble Arch. If some of you know London, it's at the corner of Hyde Park. And there are monuments there now to where they had to hang, and they'd take people through the streets, and they would hang them there for pickpocketing. And huge crowds would gather and to watch a pickpocket being hanged, and the pickpockets would work the crowd. Go figure. Pickpockets would be out there pickpocketing the people who were there. So just to show you the deterrent effect of the public execution. We don't know. You know, something else about the countries that are doing that, Saudi Arabia, Iran, these are countries with quite brutal, authoritarian regimes. And although they may be executing drug traffickers or ordinary criminals rather than political prisoners, although there's some of that, what they're doing really, I think, is sending a political message to the public that, you know, we can do this to people. You cross us, you go against us. This is the way we are. This is how we deal with people who go against us. So I think there's a lot of political, there's a lot of politics behind it. There was another hand somewhere? No? Yes.
So I'm curious about if there is any international discourse on if or how it could be considered a human rights abuse to be hiring the executioner, to be paying people to execute people. Because I see that as also, you know, a problem that nobody talks about when they talk about the death penalty. Okay, this is a criminal, and now we're gonna pay somebody else to be a murderer because they committed a crime?
Yeah. You know, it's something we don't know a great deal about. We know a little bit about it here in the US because of the people in the justice system who were involved in organizing and conducting the executions. I had a PhD student a few years ago who was trying to study this in Africa. He was working in Uganda, and he wanted to interview and meet people who'd been involved in the system to see, how they were psychologically and all of that. But he had trouble getting to them, and finally he dropped out of the program for a good reason, but he never finished his PhD. And I had another student who has now finished it. He's from Pakistan, where they still have an active death penalty, and he's been a prison warden there. He took a leave to come to London and do a PhD, and he's back there again now. And he had to accompany men, he had to organize the execution. So he was involved in the process. He wrote his thesis about the death penalty in Pakistan, and he's very committed to abolishing it, but he was part of it. We don't know much about it. We have a few prison wardens here in the US who've become very vocal abolitionists. They've written books about it and so on. But I think that's as much as I know. There we're talking sort of about what is it? Is it a violation of human rights to put someone up to doing it themselves? And it would take a special kind of person to do it, I suppose.
Or a desperate person who needs money.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's a job also. I don't think that in the United States in particular, I wouldn't say that people who work in prisons are upper middle class with necessarily a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of, so.
There were, in England, there was a famous executioner who became quite skilled at it because there's technique, and you can't really take a course on it, okay? You can't get a degree in executing anyone, but there was someone, when they were hanging, there are very important, there's an art to doing it because you have to get the noose of the right size depending on the weight of the person. The idea being, that it's a drop, so you're supposed to drop through the scaffold, and it's supposed to break your neck. Sometimes the drop pulls the head right off. Or sometimes the person, you hear them for 10 minutes struggling because they're being slowly choked. And so there was someone who knew how to do that and who was apparently good at it. They brought him for the Nuremberg trial. But here in the US now, where you're using, I think almost exclusively, you have a lethal injection or poisoning. That's a medical procedure. And the people doing it are not trained professionals. In fact, a trained professional wouldn't be allowed to do it. because it would violate, you can't have a doctor doing it. The doctor comes in after it's done, apparently, to sort of say, yeah, he's dead. Yeah, okay, I'll sign the statement. But the doctor can't participate in poisoning someone because it's against the fundamental medical ethics. So you have amateurs doing this. And that may contribute to some of the brutality because the lethal injection is held out. This is the paradox of it. The methods actually have been constantly evolving to make them less and less visibly brutal. Even the cocktail of the lethal injection, there are 3 drugs. So you only need 1 drug to kill someone, but you need 2 drugs to make sure that they don't go flaying around and that it's an ugly, brutal scene because you've got the family and other people sitting there watching it, and they don't want to have an ugly show. They just want to see someone being put to sleep. You know, so that's what they do. The part of the cocktail of drugs they give is designed to immobilize the person so that they don't soil themselves and you know, spit blood and all kinds of ugly things that happen with it. Yeah, people, there are whole books on this subject of the method of execution. Yes?
Yes, my question is, what do you think things would have to align in the United States for it to become abolished here for the long term? Like, I'm just thinking in terms of various components of the way we have a tricameral system, so I wondering how that would work.
Yeah. Well, it had seemed obvious to me until recently that it was likely to come through the Supreme Court. You know, we're all a little unnerved about what's happening there, so I feel maybe you'd say I was, you know, been smoking something this morning if I thought that was still a realistic hypothesis. That being said, absolutely, and there is lots of evidence that even the more conservative justices at the Supreme Court and at other levels of the federal justice system are unsettled about it and think it's a lot of energy and everything going into something that isn't very productive. And is it really worth being increasingly sort of the global pariahs for this as judges? They go to conferences too. They go off to Europe to judges' conference and everything, and people sort of say, you know, you decided to execute somebody, like, for what? For 20 a year? Like, what possible effect could that be having on anything? And so I can't rule that out. I can't rule that out happening. As I say, it's confined. It's pretty regional, the death penalty here, and maybe if you had significant political changes in a few states. So I know that Texas is probably not going to switch from blue to red, or is it red to blue? Which is it? No, red to blue overnight, although apparently the guy running for senator, the Democrat, has a good crack at it this time. But the demographics of Texas are changing. The more Texas resembles Mexico, the more it's likely to abolish the death penalty. And that's slowly happening there. I don't know about Florida, but maybe that will be it. You know, I could just tell you something I've seen in doing this for many years, is that sometimes the change happens very quickly and is unexpected. And as I say, it's almost all in one direction towards abolition. Very early in my work on this, now we're talking 24 years ago, I went to Geneva, to the UN Human Rights Headquarters there, for a meeting about the death penalty. And there was a panel that I was on at the United Nations headquarters about the death penalty, and I was on with a Russian and a South African, the 3 of us. So I had to speak first, and I gave my little, you know, liberal Canadian speech about how the death penalty is bad and you should abolish it like we did and everything. And they all looked at me, the South African and the Russian, and said, yeah, thanks very much, but you know, we live in the real world, thank you very much. And the South African said, you know, where I come from, we have the death penalty. We've had it, and the people love the death penalty. They're very committed to it. Public opinion hugely supports the death penalty, and moreover, we have some of the highest crime rates in the world in South Africa. This is in 1994. He said, we'll never abolish the death penalty. And then the Russian guy got up and he said, you know, South Africa, that's a picnic compared to Russia. He said, our people really love the death penalty, and we really have high rates of crimes, and we could never abolish the death penalty. And that was in 1994. And in 1995, South Africa abolished the death penalty, and in 1996, Russia abolished the death penalty. So it does happen pretty quickly. And it is, as I say, you know, whatever your position is on it, it's sort of like, it's something inevitable. It is going to happen. And at some point, that dawns even on people who you think are committed to it or who tend to be very conservative on these issues. But at some point, everywhere else in the world, it worked with liberal or conservative alike. In Britain, in France, in Africa, in Latin America, they say, let's move on. And it will happen here. But will it happen next year or in 10 years or 15 years? I don't know. I thought I could predict the future in the United States, and I've been pretty wrong the last few years, so.
Just one more.
Yes, please.
So I guess my question is about timing. So I worked in capital defense this summer, and one of my clients, it's been 20 years, and he hasn't even started his first appeal yet. And I don't know what it is in other countries, but what do you think the relationship between the time between sentence and execution is in the deterrent factor that you were talking about?
Well, I think that there are very few countries where you have this uncertainty for so long as you do here in the United States. You do in Japan as well. It's the other major developed country that still has the death penalty. And it has some real similarities with the situation here. Japan executes 4 or 5, 6 people a year, it seems, somewhere around that. So, you know, about a third of what's happening here, a third to a quarter, but then their population is about a third of the population here. So similar in some ways. And there in Japan, you know, I've been to Japan a lot on the death penalty as well. The criminal defense lawyers don't have a great record. Apparently it's something like a 99% conviction rate at trial in Japan. So I don't even know why criminal defense lawyers bother, you know, go to law school. But, you know, it's a pretty low rate. And I don't think there's very much, if any, post-conviction stuff going on there. But they wait. And the people sit there in jail for 10, 15, 20 years on death row. And then one day they come and they don't inform the family. There's no warning. They just let the family know. So it's brutal in another way. But in most of the English-speaking countries, so these are, obviously you don't have the death penalty in the UK anymore, but you do in the other Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean and in Africa, and a few in Asia, that are, you know, sort of modeled on the British system because they were former British colonies. And there you have a very predominant case law. It's not applied in every country, but once you've waited 5 years after the conviction, then it becomes a violation of the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment. It's called the death row phenomenon in the field, we call it that. And so in the Commonwealth Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and so on, they've stopped executing, partly because the lawyers have been so effective at dragging out the post-conviction that they get to the 5-year stage and then they can't. So they've essentially, it's been stopped because of all the post-conviction litigation. And that's why when Amnesty International go, the people in the government say, we still want the death penalty, but their hands are tied now by that case law. And I don't see that changing. And it's convenient to the politicians because they can turn to the public and say, yeah, we tried to do it, but these stupid judges have tied our hands. And so, okay, that's how they get there. In the US, you've never really had an effective challenge. And I don't know what the explanation is, why because everything else, every little detail of the death penalty in the US has been exhaustively litigated. And that one didn't. There was a case 25 years ago where did they deny cert on it? I can't even remember the name of the case. It's the one case where they cited me, the US Supreme Court, in a denial of cert on the issue. But the idea was they were looking at, the challenge was this death row phenomenon, the wait as being cruel, inhuman, or degrading. Even at the international level, the bodies, the international tribunals are divided amongst it on this question. They're divided because some of them say don't try to push that idea that if you wait too long, it's a violation of the rights, because then they'll speed up the executions. But in practice, that doesn't seem to happen. So I don't know if that really addresses your question, but it's you know, it's a fact. The thing that's also changed here over the years in the U.S. with the death row phenomenon, with the wait on death row, people still wait. I forget what the number of years they wait has gone up. It must be around 13 or 14 years on the average now. Is it higher?
Higher, yeah.
Even higher. But the size of your death row is shrinking now. It had increased. From the time the death penalty was reinstated in '76, it continued to grow and it hit about 3,000. And now it's dropping. Because if you're only sentencing 30 people a year, that was the case last year, I mean, most of these guys die of natural causes. Old men, harmless old men in jail. And so as that happens, the death row shrinks. And someone can do a prediction to see how that will happen. But you know, you don't have to be very sophisticated to realize that if you're sentencing 30 people a year to death, you're not going to keep replenishing that death row.
I'd like to thank Professor Schabas for giving us a very edifying presentation.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you all for attending and urge you to also attend future Talsky Center lecture series events. Thank you.